Thank you, everybody, for joining us here at the Geological Society for the 12th Clash of the Titans forecasting event. It's a real pleasure to see so many of you here and so many young faces, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing all of the predictions this evening. I'm joined by three eminent economists at the top of their field, and as you can see, I am not Linda Yueh, but I've been promised that she will be with us very shortly, so you don't have to put up with me for too long. Right, before we get started, we'll run very quickly through some of the results from last year. And we had another set of three eminent economists challenging the competition last year. Philip Millard, Yueh Selfin, and Innes McPhee. And you can see some of their results up there. I'm very pleased to announce that Stephen was the winner of the Titans competition last year. Very well done, good job. And we're hoping for an intense competition in the way that we did in the last year. With regards to the GDP growth figures, our Titans tended to be more pessimistic than the results actually bore out, perhaps understandably so. With regards to inflation, I think they were decent enough in terms of their pick, with Innes getting the Q2 figure bang on there. Unemployment was predicted to be ever so slightly higher than it actually was, which probably links to that pessimistic GDP prediction that we saw from our Titans as well. And moving on to interest rates, sorry. Whilst they seem to overestimate interest rates in Q4 2022, I think that potentially comes as quite a quirk of the way we calculate things in the competition. So it's good that you guys are here to listen to this now. We saw interest rates at 3.5% last December, but obviously they had been rising up to that point. So the average quarter, which is what we're actually calculating, was a little bit lower than that. Okay, so when you're putting in your predictions, do bear that in mind. And as we see with earnings growth, they were consistently lower than the actual data and got further away as time passes. As we can understand, economic forecasting is an incredibly challenging task, and that's why we haven't got anybody here with 0 points, not even any of the experts really. And we're probably likely to see that play out again this year. But what has been quite a good positive is our overall winner of the competition, Ariana Daly, who unfortunately can't be with us today. Our winning Titan scored 100 points, and she has managed to score just 64 points. So the lower the better in this competition. She was an average of 0.26 away from the actual data in each prediction, and accurately predicted 5 data points and was just 1.1 away in 4 others. So a very big congratulations to Ariana, and I believe her parents are here to accept that reward for her. Thank you. Okay, so on to this year's competition. I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Costas Milas from the University of Liverpool, Dr. Emily Whitehouse from the University of Sheffield, and Professor Michael Kitson from the University of Cambridge. And we will begin tonight's talk with Professor Costas Milas.
Oh, thank you.
No problem.
Hello, everybody. I'm Costas Milas, Professor of Finance at Liverpool University. So, some of the things I will discuss today are based on joint empirical work with my colleague, Dr. Mike Ellington from Liverpool. Now, Mike Ellington is the reason I'm here. When I received the invitation, he told me, or he reminded me, that 10 years ago, he came here as an MSc student to attend the event. And I found this very promising because now Mike is a senior lecturer at Liverpool. So hopefully some of you, 10, 12 years from now, you will go down the same academic route, which will be very pleasing for us, guys. Thank you. Right, we're talking about titans. The first one that came to my mind was Greek scientist Thales of Miletus, who famously noted that the past is certain, but the future is obscure. Then Dan Brown, the famous author, in his Da Vinci Code book, noted somewhere hidden in his pages that today is today, but there are many tomorrows. Now, I'm afraid to tell you that both of them are to some extent wrong. And this is why, because statistical revisions suggest that what we think about the past might not be correct. In fact, the past changes as well as the present changes as we move on. And let me explain that in my following chart. So what I have done here, I have collected real-time annual GDP growth for the UK economy from 1973 onwards. And I have also used the revised, or let's call them final, estimates of annual GDP growth over the same period. So what you're going to see, what you see probably here is that revised data are consistently below real-time data. First-time estimates are consistently below revised data. In fact, if you do some simple statistics, you will see that annual GDP growth since 1973 for the UK economy, based on the first estimates of data, is 1.3%. Revised GDP growth, based on the most recent data, is going up to 2%. Therefore, the ONS, as we move on, appears to be consistently rising. And this has implications for forecasting, as I'm going to discuss in a minute. So, first of all, I will just give you a quick, well, I will provide my initial forecast, and then I will elaborate on them. GDP growth, I'm afraid, I'm not a pessimistic person, but my feeling is that in this quarter, it will be minus 1% quarter on quarter growth. Now, I was trying to, I was not sure whether it's going to be minus 1.1 or minus 0.2%, but I will explain that in a moment. So I took a less pessimistic view. Then, as we move on through 2024, we go to flat GDP growth, and then growth picks up a bit. I will explain in a second. Inflation continues dropping up to 3% in 2024 quarter 3, which is still 1 percentage point above the target. Unemployment, and I will talk about unemployment in a minute because there is a serious issue here, is going to slowly increase to 4.6%. Interest rates, and now I have to say that my interest rates here are based on the last month of the quarter, sorry. So for 5.25% in the last quarter of 2023, go down to 5% in March 2024. So probably I'm one of the very few economists or financial economists that believe that the Bank of England will cut in the first quarter. The Bank of England keeps on saying they won't cut. We'll see that. I believe that they might cut. And then by 2024 quarter 3, interest rates are cut to 4.5%. Interestingly, earnings growth weakens a bit, but remains above inflation. And therefore, real wage growth remains positive. I will talk about the exchange rate in a minute. So what are my prediction highlights? GDP contracts in the last quarter of 2023, this quarter, and slightly recovers. And as GDP initially contracts and weakens and then recovers, unemployment goes up in the beginning. Inflation drops, wage growth stays above inflation, and therefore real wage growth hopefully converges by the end of 2024 to the long-run average of 1% over the last 800 years. Believe it or not, the Bank of England provides data for more than 800 years on wages. And of course, I would like to see more robust wage growth, but this requires productivity gains. Unfortunately, productivity is not, we're not doing very well in productivity. And this has to do with a lack or weak business investment. So currently at 5.25%, the official bank rate is above the 4.7% average over the last 300 years or so. My predictions for GDP weakness until mid-2024 are largely based on what we call follow the money argument. So what is money? Money measures liquidity. More money stimulates the economy, but also adds to inflation. So what is happening to money? And I will use my preferred measure here of money, which is Divizia M4. It's a special measure of money, liquidity in the economy, which unfortunately, since the beginning of 2023, growth rate has turned negative. So growth rate of money, liquidity has turned negative. This is going to drag inflation down faster, in my view, than what the Bank of England believes. And at the same time, because of the lack of liquidity, GDP takes a hit also. And this explains my thinking for GDP weakness and inflation going down. From mid-2024, of course, in my forecast, GDP picks up. And I think this is also happening apart from cutting the interest rate. Why is happening? Because EU growth increases from 0.6% in 2023 to 1.3% in 2024 based on consensus estimates in the euro area. And I'm using the euro growth. Why? Because 42% of our exports are going to the EU. So our main trading partner picks up in growth, we strengthen our growth also. Now, the exchange rate is a measure of confidence in the UK economy. The UK growth is going to remain fairly weak. Eurozone growth slightly improves. So I'm thinking here that the exchange rate will go down to 108 from 116 today. A black swan event that might upset my predictions, two actual events. I refer to one here. I will flag rising economic policy uncertainty related to the timing and possibly the result of the general election. Think only if Rishi Sunak decides to call the elections for January 2025. He can do that. Nobody expects that, but think what will happen if he drags so much in time. Economic policy uncertainty slows down investment and consequently harms the economy. No doubt about that. Since 2010, we had 5 different prime ministers and 7 different chancellors of the exchequer. Who is going to invest when there is political, economic uncertainty going on and on? Think what will happen if they keep on delaying the election. And the second black swan event, which I don't refer to here, is unemployment. As you probably know, the ONS has difficulty to measure unemployment accurately now because of survey issues. So the unemployment rate is currently stuck at 4.2%. Think what will happen if they manage to improve on the surveys and we find that the actual unemployment rate is 4.6 or even 5%, which will be consistent with the weakness in GDP. This is definitely a black swan event that will turn things around, a shock to everybody. Should you have faith in my forecasts or the forecast of any other economic expert, whether a titan or a non-titan? In November 2019, Chris Giles, the economics editor of the Financial Times, wrote that economists in trust surveys perform poorly compared to scientists medics, and I'm embarrassed to say that we only do better than journalists and politicians. So how can we defend or even improve our own forecasts? Well, we should first of all flag that our forecasts are based on real-time data to a great extent. And as I discussed earlier on, real-time data is revised continuously. So I run my forecasting model based on earlier data. Earlier data supports my forecast. Here comes the revision in GDP. And of course, it upsets my forecast. And I look really bad. And this is perhaps one way to think about my defense. Another defense is I need to use, or all of us need to use, different models and provide alternative forecasts. So what I did here is just provided an estimate, a point estimate. What I should have done is provided different estimates conditional on different or alternative scenarios. I didn't do that, but this is what I need to do as an economist. Well, in my case, I relied on the follow the money argument and weak growth in the EU. It is my job as an economist and our job as financial economists or economists to inform the public that there are no right answers to every economic question. Like, what is the right, most reliable forecast for GDP? There is no right answer to that. So by acknowledging this truth, we will definitely please historians who consider anathema the misguided idea that there are right answers to every historical question. So we need to follow the historians here. Can your forecast be better than mine? Very much so, and I hope you do better than mine, because this will give you an incentive to continue into the profession. So since I have some good news for you, back in August, I wrote a piece for the Financial Times, and I provide some links here. And what I found is that the public forecasts inflation better than the experts of the Bank of England. The public manages to overestimate actual inflation by an annual average of only 10 basis points, whereas the Bank of England consistently underpredicts inflation. And since 2006, the Bank of England, in their monetary policy reports, have underestimated CPI inflation by an annual average of 68 basis points. Therefore, it is promising to pay attention to the wisdom of crowds. With this in mind, I invite you to have faith in your own forecast, the very best of luck, and thank you for listening to me.
Oh, hi. Lovely. Lovely to be here. Finally. Good to see everyone. And can I, we're just to confirm, we'll go to Emily, and we've already done the amazing prize for the, I mean, just another round of applause. I cannot believe that a sixth former has beaten the Titans for 2 years in a row. And so with that, we'll invite up Emily Whitehouse to do her forecast. Oh, by the way, I'm Linda Yueh. I ranked last when I was a Titan a couple of years ago, so that's my claim to fame. Okay, so thank you very much to the Economic Research Council for organising this event and inviting me to present my forecast. It was a little bit nerve-wracking sort of sending over these slides yesterday when I knew that we had 3 rounds of interest rate announcements in the 24 hours before I got to present them. Fortunately, I don't think much that I planned to say has changed. As Costas has alluded to, the Bank of England has been very clear that interest rates are going to remain high in the short term. That's sort of not necessarily aligned with what the markets are saying. I think that we are certainly likely to see interest rate cuts happening in the Federal Reserve in the US and at the ECB in the EU, based on the way that inflation is coming down in those areas quicker. And so I am perhaps pessimistically, and perhaps based on the last 24 hours, too pessimistically, saying that interest rates are going to stay high for an extended period for the duration of this forecast period, but I do think we'll have cuts before the end of 2024. Given this high interest rate environment, of course, our concern then is around how that's going to impact on the housing market as mortgage payments become much more expensive. Well, during the pandemic, we saw very strong house price growth. Part of my research looks at real-time monitoring of bubbles and crashes. And if we try to monitor house prices, we see evidence of a bubble in the housing market emerging sort of middle of 2021. And we also see evidence of a crash of that bubble towards the end of 2022. And of course, the concern there is really, well, what's the severity of this crash going to be? Is it going to be akin to something like we saw in 2008? Because if it is, that's going to have quite big implications for our GDP forecasts. As household wealth declines, households perhaps make decisions to adjust their consumption in response to that. Well, we do know that 45% of fixed rate mortgages that were agreed at a point where rates were much lower have yet to refinance. So certainly that suggests we've not seen the full effect of these high interest rates on the housing market yet. I think we can expect further declines. But on the positive side, it's worth remembering that actually only about 30% of UK households have a mortgage. And also compared to 2007, we've seen a tightening in lending standards. If you look at these graphs, this one at the top looks at the proportion of mortgages with a loan to value ratio of over 95%. You can see that's dropped off since 2007. Likewise, if we look at borrowing, where the amount of borrowing has been more than 3.5 times income for individuals or 2.75 times income for joint, we again see a drop in that proportion. We also know that there's a higher proportion of fixed rate mortgages versus variable mortgages as well. And that's important because it lessens the shock. We don't have everyone immediately paying these higher rates. There's a more gradual transition. And also potentially households then can sort of plan in the future for this additional expenditure. And there's also some evidence then that mortgage holders are taking some measures to kind of reduce that financial burden themselves, whether that's through extending the mortgage term, moving to interest-only payments, etc. And whilst there might be some longer-term economic consequences of these things, at least in the short run, it helps weather the storm in the housing market. So I do think house prices will continue to decline through 2024, but I don't think we're looking at another 2008 in terms of the severity of this crash. So moving on to GDP growth then, and this kind of ties in with what I'm saying around mortgages, the Bank of England estimates that more than half of the impact of interest rates on GDP is still to come. In terms of fiscal policy, we saw some loosening in the recent budget, this national insurance tax cut, but that is not going to be enough to sort of offset the loss in take-home pay that households will have as a result of the freezing of the allowance and thresholds for income tax. We've actually seen a bit of a recovery in terms of consumer confidence indices. If you look at this top graph here, since 2022, but business confidence continues to decline as well. So I'm thinking we're going to have flat GDP to end the year, but then I am predicting a couple of or some consecutive quarters of negative growth in 2024, albeit of a very small magnitude. I think we will see a shallow recession in 2024. In terms of inflation, the fall in inflation and headline inflation throughout 2023 has very much been driven by a fall in energy prices. You can see that with these light blue bars on the top graph. Food price inflation has been coming down much more slowly. And this is a concern, particularly for low-income households where food expenditure makes up a larger proportion of their income. But if we look at the producer price index for food, which tends to be a leading indicator of CPI, we do see that that's coming down. And therefore, we should expect food price inflation to continue to go down in the coming months as well. We also had the fall in the Ofgem energy cap in October, should drive lower inflation towards the end of the year. So my inflation forecast, I think, very much in line with Costas. I have it coming down to around 3% by Q3 of 2024. Worth mentioning, of course, that CPI is so determined by swings in energy prices, and of course this sort of developments in Geopolitical events like Middle East and Russia, Ukraine has the potential to massively throw up these forecasts. In terms of the labour market then, having had a very tight labour market through 2022, there's been some signs of that cooling. Unemployment is rising and vacancies are decreasing. I'm reluctant to call this a historical average now because I'm talking about 20 years and Costas is talking about 800 years, but at least based on a 20-year historical average, this still looks like quite a tight labour market. You can see we're sort of higher than the average over these last 20 years. And combined with inflation pressures, we've therefore seen strong earnings growth in 22 and 23. In terms of what happens next, I think this continuing decline of the vacancies to unemployment ratio, plus the fact we're expecting inflation to come down, should mean that earnings growth comes down, but I'm still expecting it to be above a 20-year average of around 3%. I'll have it coming down to about 5.5% by the end of Q3 next year. Unemployment also continues to trend upwards as well. And then I wanted to be sort of transparent about how I came up with these numbers for these forecasts. I don't have the confidence to trust my own judgment, so I'm using a model. Particularly, I'm using a VAR model of the UK economy. I appreciate we've got students in the room who haven't been exposed to the wonderful world of econometrics yet. But essentially what this does is it's a way of trying to quantify the relationship between a bunch of variables and particularly the lags of those variables. So what does, the interest rate a quarter ago, how does that affect inflation today, and so on. I want to know whether the forecasts that this model produce are any good or not. So I'm going to produce forecasts for a period from 2021 Q1 to 2023 Q3 so that I can compare those forecasts with the actual data. The measure of accuracy I'm using is something called root mean squared error. Essentially, the lower this is, the better. The lower it is, the more accurate these forecasts are. And I want to compare the accuracy of my forecasts to forecasts that the Bank of England and the OBR produced as well. What we can see, if you look at this top graph, which looks at root mean squared errors for GDP growth, the VAR model actually does pretty well here, tends to be the most accurate forecast over most of this period. However, if we look at inflation, you see the VAR model doesn't do particularly well. And the relative accuracy of the OBR versus Bank of England forecasts is also changing throughout this quite a small time period. And what that suggests to me is we probably want to do some kind of forecast combination. So the numbers that I've presented here are essentially a weighted average of forecasts from this model, from the Bank of England and from the OBR, where we're using a different set of weights for each variable, depending on their accuracy in that evaluation period. And then finally, just to finish off then with my black swan event, I've talked a bit about the residential property market. My black swan event is what if we were to have a very severe collapse in the commercial property market. Obviously, during COVID, we saw this shift in working behaviour from working in the office to working at home. And it's not clear to what extent that is a sort of permanent versus temporary effect. If we look at office vacancy rates, both in London and in other cities, they certainly don't still look like they're coming down. They're either continuing to trend upwards or they're constant. Okay. And if we have empty office spaces in the city centre, then that might have knock-on effects then for retail spaces as well, which could exacerbate some potential collapse in the commercial property market. And that's it from me.
Fantastic, so interesting. And next up, last but not least, Michael Kitson from Cambridge.
Thank you, Linda. There's a summary of Emily's forecast there for you to look at, but we'll have those later on. Thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Michael Kitson. I'm an economist from the Judge Business School in the University of Cambridge. I used to be in the economics faculty. I'm no longer in the economics faculty. I'm in the business school. I'm also a fellow of St. Catherine's College. So if any of the young people in the room are thinking of applying to Cambridge, just to remind you, you probably know that St. Catherine's is the best college in Cambridge. There's at least two of us in the room who agree with that. So thank you. Yeah. So I should also give the warning here. I am not an economic forecaster. I am a macroeconomist, but I'm also an economic historian, and I look at primarily the economics of innovation. So my forecasts are really guides. I've not got a model, and I've not got an underlying model to give you my conclusions. And I'm also a skeptical economist. I think economics is a useful discipline, but it's not quite as useful as many economists think it is. So I'm slightly skeptical of the power of economics. And I'll just mention that. So first of all, my forecasts. So not massively out of line with the experts here. I'm not an expert on forecasting. So I think GDP growth is going to be relatively modest, not as modest perhaps as some. Inflation, of course, you know the inflation target is 2%. We're not going to get back to inflation target yet. Unemployment, I think, will slightly creep up and interest rates will remain higher. So I think they might last a little bit longer than Costas. For those of you who are doing your forecasting and you're entering the competition, remember that you can get a range of forecasts that are published by a range of institutions that are available from the OBR and on the Bank of England's website. So when you of course, you'll have your wisdom, but if you want to look at what others are thinking, you don't just have to rely on the OBR's forecast or the Bank of England's forecast. They also publish what all the other institutions are forecasting as well. And there's quite a range out there. One reason I should add that I'm slightly pessimistic, perhaps on the pessimistic range on growth, is particularly because of what's happening in terms of UK immigration. So whatever you think about the politics of UK immigration, and perhaps that's something for discussion and debate, immigration will slow economic growth in the UK economy. The two main reasons that people come into the UK economy are to work and to study. So it affects us who are working in universities, but it will also affect the growth of our economy. It might lead also some tightening of the labour market. The other factor we were particularly asked to do was to look at black swans. Now, this is particularly difficult, and I will mention this in a minute. So I've got a positive and a negative. The negative one I've given to the organisers. My negative one is whether we have increasing hostilities between Taiwan and China. Unfortunately, we've got two wars in the world at the moment. I'm not expecting it to happen. It's a black swan prediction, but if we get increasing hostilities, this will have an effect on global markets, on supply chain, and on perhaps rising inflation. A more positive, perhaps black swan, is what will the impact be of AI? Will AI have a transformational effect on economic growth? Now, Roy Amara, who's a US scientist, and I think he's right, I would agree with this, is we tend to overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run, but tend to underestimate it in the long run. And we see that since the Industrial Revolution. Major innovations take a long time to have economic growth. So perhaps I think it may not have a major effect in this window, but over the longer period of time, it may have significant effects on economic growth. But really, I should add, these are not black swans, because if it's a black swan, you cannot predict it. So the fact I'm saying these things may happen means they are not black swans. So a black swan is an unpredictable event that has potentially severe consequences. So the fact these possibilities may arise, they do not mean there are black swans. We can't really predict the black swan because otherwise it wouldn't be a black swan. Now, some other observations in terms of the context of what we're talking about. And here I go back to what Costas was saying. And I think we may have some agreement here. What we have not been asked to forecast is productivity. And actually, productivity is arguably the most important economic variable. Now, if you go to Paul Krugman, a very distinguished economist who's won the Nobel Prize for economics, not for writing articles in the New York Times, I may add. He got the Nobel Prize for his work on industrial organization and the importance of geography. But Paul Krugman said, productivity is not everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. Because productivity growth will tell you whether wages are growing, whether profits are growing, and whether governments can extract more tax revenue from us to pay for important services. And again, I think I'm picking up Costas's messaging here. Productivity in the UK has been dismal since the financial crisis. So there's many measures of productivity, by the way. So you'll find that when you go to, those of you who go to study economics. So you see this is output per hour worked. It's a report, very good report, just published recently by the Resolution Foundation, using ONS data. So you can see the downturn in productivity following the financial crisis. It's about 24% below trend. So if it was higher, when we'd have higher wages, higher profits, governments would have higher revenue in terms of tax revenue, or we could take a day off work and work 4 days a week rather than 5 days a week. So productivity is very important for wage growth, profit growth, and it's been dismal. And again, there's lots of discussion about whether this is a real issue, whether it's a measurement error, whether it's a short-term problem, whether it's a long-term problem. But again, I'm agreeing with colleagues, which is a rare surprise. I think I agree with Costas that investment is part of the problem here, because what we see is a big downturn in investment in terms of, these are OBR forecasts, and you see the OBR consistently gets it wrong. And then there's the outturn, and it revises its OBR forecast, and then it's revised down again. Now, I should add, this is business investment. This is investment as far as a macroeconomist is concerned. This is net investment by companies. It's not investment in stocks and shares and bonds. Okay, it's firms investing in new plant, machinery, new factories, new offices. It's a real thing. It's capital investment. It's not stock, shares, and bonds. That's another thing. So pretty dismal record of investment in the UK. Now, let me say something also about my forecasts. My alternative title was actually why I will almost certainly be wrong. Because economic forecasting, I leave it to the experts, it's incredibly difficult, and it's difficult to get economic forecasting right, particularly in the short run. It's much better to do it in the long run. I'm going to get it wrong, and the experts get it wrong. Just to illustrate that, this is the latest report. This is published quarterly by the Bank of England, this Monetary Policy Committee. So this is the latest projection on output by the Bank of England. So what you see here is you see a big crisis because of COVID. You see a bounce back, then you return, and then in the long run we have this nice blue steady path of positive, hopefully positive growth. It's a fan diagram, so there's a bit of variation around it, but tends to be positive growth. Now let's go back and see what the Bank of England was saying in 2010. Okay, slightly different graphics, not quite as sophisticated as then, but this is the fan diagram then. You see, we had the financial crisis, then we had the return, and the return was the projection then was to say, well, it'll be nice steady growth. So financial crisis, nice steady growth. Now let's go back to when the financial crisis was just starting, and that was in August 2007. And what was it predicting then? Nice steady growth. Look where the horizontal line, the zero is. Okay, there's no crisis. Okay, so in 2007, they were saying the economy is going to grow in a nice steady path. 2010, we've had this major shock with the financial crisis, but it's going to growing at a nice steady path. And now we've improved our graphics, but in 2023, we've had COVID crisis, we've had a bounce back, but we're going to return to a nice steady path. Now, this isn't a criticism of the Bank of England. Actually, quite a few of my students work at the Bank of England, and they're very successful there too. Ex-students, I may add. But it's an issue with economic modelling. It's very difficult to forecast what's going to happen in terms of short-run variations. Just to give you an element in terms of the financial crisis, many organisations forecast, okay, particularly banks, private sector organisations, public sector organisations. This was the forecast, but just before the financial crisis. What was going to happen in 2008, 2009? These are all these organizations doing forecasting. So all of them were on the positive side, except for one. Okay, so most economic forecasting before the financial crisis was saying over the next couple of years, the economy is going to grow between 2 and 4 or 5%. The actual outrun is this bottom line here, nearly a 6% fall in GDP. Again, this is not a criticism of economic forecasting. It's very difficult to forecast these sorts of changes and shocks that actually affect us and affect people's lives. So I want to highlight just in my final few minutes is to say something about the limits of economic forecasting. First of all, remember what economic models are trying to do. They're trying to explain to people why they do what they do. Okay, why we might go out and work, why we might buy goods and services and so on. And that's very difficult. We'll come back to that, particularly the use of mathematical modeling. Secondly, what's important for economies are often institutions. And economic models are not good, or they're trying to embrace institutions. And thirdly, what we know now is particularly important is the importance of shocks to an economy. And it's very difficult, although they try to actually model shocks. These are very different, challenging issues to embrace. So first of all, let me say something about the modeling. This is the use of mathematics in economics. It is very dominant, not just in econometrics, but actually in mathematical modeling. The state of modern economics, I would say, some could say has a problem or an issue with physics envy. We can use maths to explain why people do what they do. Now, how can we use math model? All of these people in the room say you're an economy. How can we use mathematical models to explain whether you will buy, whether you consume, whether you'll work, whether you save, and so on? Well, we assume we're all broadly similar. Okay, people are rational and respond to incentives. Individuals maximize their welfare. You are maximizing your utility if you're doing it at A level, or firms maximize their profits. These are important guides to behavior, but they're not the only reason that people do what they do. We often think there's other disciplines to explain why people do what they do. And we're driven by norms, we're driven by conventions, we're driven by fairness, we're driven by lots of drivers about driving economic behavior. So I'm actually a person who thinks we need to be very careful about the use of maths in economics. I should say, for all of you who are going to think about studying economics, you'll be doing a lot of maths, okay, in most of the institutions you go to. It's a very mathy subject now. And I have some concerns about that. And I'll go back here to a very distinguished economist called Alfred Marshall. Now, if you want to read about Alfred Marshall, I recommend Linda's book, The Great Economists. There's definitely a chapter in there about Marshall. Marshall was a Cambridge economist. He was a mathematician by training, and for all of those who were studying A level, all those supply and demand diagrams you keep changing and shifting and so on, he invented them. So he invented the supply and demand diagrams. So he's a mathematician by training. But what did he say? He said a good mathematical theorem dealing with economic hypotheses was very unlikely to be good economics. And he had his rules for dealing with maths. These are Marshall's rules, and I think they're not bad rules. So his rules were, number one, use mathematics as a shorthand language rather than as an engine of inquiry. Number two, keep to them till you have done. Number three, translate into English. Number four, then illustrate by examples that are important in real life. Then number five, burn the mathematics. And then number six, if you can't succeed in four, burn three. This last I did often. Actually, much of modern economics doesn't get really past point one now. It's incredibly maths driven. So that's fine. If you really like maths, you'll do well in most economics degrees, but bear that in mind when you're thinking about studying it. A couple of other issues to be borne in mind which make it difficult to model. And that's the importance of institutions. Institutions are important in economies. Economists don't think in terms of institutions or systems. Economists think in terms of markets. But actually, sometimes economic institutions and economic systems are important. Engineers always think in terms of systems. They don't think in terms of markets. So we need to think about in systems. It may be property rights. It may be government. Firms themselves are part of the institutional process. If you go back to those failure to predict the financial crisis, most of the models at that time didn't have banks in them. So most of those models couldn't have a bank failure because banks weren't in the models. Okay, modeling is improved, but it's a real issue to think about. It's a real difficulty to think about institutions. My third and final point is an issue about shocks. This is a question for you. What was the English dictionary word of the year last year, 2022? This is Collins' dictionary. They all have them now. Sorry? COVID. It wasn't COVID, no, but thank you for participating. Any of the younger people, bear in mind you get asked questions when you get to university and you're expected to participate. Sorry?
Boris Johnson's word, I can't remember.
Boris Johnson's word.
Yeah, he coined.
Was that Peppa Pig or something along those lines? No, I'm not sure it was his word, but anybody guess? I said it's something to do with shocks. Something to do with shocks. Okay, this was the. By the way, there's no prize. There's no prize.
Multi-splurge or something like that.
Multi-splurge is quite good, but it's not right. It's not. Omni-shambles. Great idea. No. Wrong. Anyway, so this is turning into an omni-shambles. I'll move. It was permacrisis. Okay. Omni-shambles, permacrisis, same thing. What's a permacrisis? It's an extended period of instability and insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. We've gone from one crisis to another. We've gone from the financial crisis, we mentioned, we had a sovereign debt crisis, a euro crisis, we've had COVID, we've had dreadfully 2 wars, and we've had major increases in protectionism around the world. A related concept, and you will hear this, by the way, quite often, is another one which is called a polycrisis. The polycrisis is a bit different. Permacrisis is one crisis after another. The polycrisis is the simultaneous occurrence of several catastrophic events. And so the argument is we're living now in a polycrisis. We get again two major wars. We've got protectionism. We've got countries going inward looking. We've had a cost of living crisis and causing major problems. Make it really difficult, even more difficult than normal for economic forecasters to understand the way the world's going to develop and the way the economies are going to develop. Just a couple of final points on this, on the issue about crises and the issue about risks, and perhaps related back to the issue of black swans. The World Economic Forum produces a global risk report every year. This is published in the beginning, this one published in the beginning of this year, 2023. In the next few months, beginning of next year, will be 2024. How do they do this? They ask the great and the good, what do they think of the major crises happening in the world in over 2 years and over 10 years? That's the latest one. Some of you may have filled this survey in if you're a business leader or a policy leader. Some of the younger people, you'll be filling it in future when you're helping to lead major institutions. The risk categories are blue economic, green environmental, orange geopolitical, red societal, and purple technological. And it does vary from country to country, but this is the global picture. That's the global picture at the moment. So big concern, cost of living crisis. Then in 10 years, really the failure of climate change despite COPs and so on. Now, if we go back to 2021, this is the report published in 2021. It was a slightly different way to publish it. It was about likelihood and impact. So here I'm just showing the likelihood. So this was in 2021. So this is the 2021 data. So climate change, again, important and so on. I just want you to draw you to one row. 2020. Here's again another question for you. What's not there? Published in the beginning of 2020. COVID. No COVID, no infectious diseases and so on. And again, not a black swan event. We should have known that there's a chance of another infection. Okay, so it's not there. Cost of living crisis is not there. So we can go back to that great philosopher Donald Rumsfeld here and just think about the unknown unknowns, the thing that people were, the unknown factors. So there will be shocks that we see, but also shocks that we don't see. And that can disrupt businesses as well, disrupt our economists. So my final point to mention is that I think economics is a useful guide to the way the world works and how economies develop. It is not perhaps as scientific as many economists think it is. I think it's more of an arts and humanity rather than, or certainly it's a social science rather than like a natural science. And so, particularly for the people in the room who are thinking about studying economics, if I'm being skeptical about the power of economic modeling, if I'm skeptical about the use of maths in modern economics, why should you study economics? Well, here I will go back to a quote from Joan Robinson, a Cambridge economist that also appears in Linda Yueh's book. The only woman, I think, is in that book. Again, that's another issue about economics. The gender balance is pretty shocking, and it has been for a long period of time. But Joan Robinson told us why we should study economics. She said, the purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. So for those of you who want to study economics, it will be very important in later life because you won't be deceived by economists. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Fabulous. I'm actually going to invite the Titans to come up to answer questions about their forecast, but what a great set of presentations. Who cares if the forecasts are wrong? I mean, the presentations are great. I mean, the process is fantastic. Actually, and Michael, thank you very much for the kind reference to my book. I was about to give you one more quote from Joan Robinson, another one. And she said, I never learned mathematics, so I had to think. So I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment. But as you can see, there's some alignment, but some differences in terms of these forecasts, so especially for the students in the room. Take a moment, take a look, and we'll drill down into some of those in just a sec. But what I'd like to actually probe with the panel is, and I think Michael's explained it really well, black swans versus, a risk or a shock, which is a known unknown versus an unknown unknown, which is a black swan. I think the story of black swans is somebody said, no, they can't possibly exist. Then they went to Australia and saw one and said, aha, So let's focus on, I mean, black swan here is just a shorthand. So it'd be really, I just wanted to pick up on your kind of risk event that could derail your crisis, because I think each of you picked different ones, and I actually think they are all really interesting and probably something that maybe with the review of the Bank of England's forecasting model by Ben Bernanke, the former Fed chairman, maybe we will actually hear a little bit more about how forecasts can be tempered by scenarios and by shocks, which are known unknowns, and how you actually factor that in. So let me start with I'm just going to call those, I hate quoting Donald Rumsfeld, by the way. Now you've got it stuck in my head, Michael. But Costas, in terms of yours, thinking about a potential shock, like a general election, that's I would say that's we will have one. We just don't know when. So we'll have one by January 2025. But just kind of talk us through how this general election could influence the numbers that we see by your forecast there. So give you an opportunity to elaborate a little bit. And of course, if there's a change in government, firstly, does that actually matter? And secondly, what are your thoughts around those?
Well, I mean,
Yeah, sure.
Is it working?
It is.
Hi there. The idea is that hopefully we are going to have an election in May next year. So, but then we don't know if this is going to happen because, as I said, the government has the ability and the right to wait until January 2025. So I think my point here is that, we know we have an election. Let's get on with that so everybody can plan ahead. That's point number one. The other thing that really worries me is that, now we are at the end of the year. So instead of talking about, what really matters for the economy, like productivity, how we are going to bring more business investments, in fact, how we are going to bring more foreign direct investments, because foreign direct investments themselves, and I provide a link in my presentation to some of my own work, foreign direct investments themselves drive productivity upwards in this country. So instead of thinking about that, when you have politicians, you have the government, that what they are talking about? They are talking about immigration. Okay, that's perhaps an important issue. How to stop the boats, that's another issue. And instead of getting on with a job, they're trying to tear themselves apart. So we are in a situation where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty as we move on. And the last thing that businesses are going to do is invest. They're going to wait and wait and wait until this situation clears. And that's my main thinking here. And as I said, up to last week, look at the headlines of the newspapers. Is Rishi Sunak going to survive that? Are we going to have a new conservative leader? So you are going to go back to the members of the Conservative Party to elect a new prime minister. Who is going to invest in this toxic, from a political point of view, environment? This is a worry for me. It might not be a worry for them, but it's a worry for me.
Thank you very much, Costas. Really interesting. Emily, can I come to you on your shock that could derail your forecast? You chose commercial real estate. We're quite aligned because my new book that came out in May is actually called The Great Crashes. And cheery title. And by the way, when economists say great, they usually mean the opposite. So just kind of talk us through commercial real estate. Absolutely fascinating to see vacancies still kind of holding up despite the working from home. And obviously one of the things that's happened is a reconfiguration of space. So if you go to the office, you're not going to go and just go sit in your office by yourself. You want co-working space. And I always thought that ended up potentially spreading out an office, but more importantly, elevated borrowing costs. You've got a shallow recession, rates stay higher for longer, makes it the property sector, which tends to be indebted, the commercial side, so just talk us through if that, how that might feed in through your forecast or make that recession worse.
Microphone or you? So I think there are keys. I think what's really interesting here is this is behavioral. This is around the shift to working from home and workers' preferences. And although there are a lot of media headlines around sort of companies mandating get back to the office, with a reasonably tight labour market, it's not clear how successful companies are going to be able to get people to do that. I agree around this idea of co-working spaces, but I can talk about my experience at a university. What's happening is that universities are saying, why are all these offices empty? I don't think you need as much space as you did before. Surely we could have one large open plan room instead of this whole building. And so that you're seeing some element of downsizing in terms of space. And then the other aspect of this is that whereas when we talked about residential market, saying only 30% of households have a mortgage, the commercial side is much more heavily indebted. I don't know the figures. And so the concern is to what extent are banks exposed to this commercial lending, the value of assets underlying this borrowing, are they declining now substantially?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, looking at in this part of the cycle, when rates are high, which is unusual in this part of the cycle, I think it is, indeed something to watch for. So Michael, your forecast, which is, I think rightly in inverted commas, you just reminded me of another economist joke. There actually are quite a few economist jokes. It's just too easy, which is, why do economists forecast the future when they're not even sure what happened in the past? Because everything gets revised. So your potential shock to your forecast is geoeconomics. So China, Taiwan has an election in January. And in fact, 2024 is apparently the historic year where it has the most elections ever in history, where over 4 billion that's more than half the world's population will go to the polls. Now, of course, India accounts for quite a lot of that, about a third of that. But still, I mean, it is potentially quite a big geoeconomic year. Geoeconomics just refers to the fact that geopolitics now affects economic decisions, the weaponization of trade and supply chains, which is, of course, one of the things that Taiwan is key to. But just kind of draw out what happens, in your view, if you do have a Taiwan-China escalation, what happens to the UK economy?
Well, I hope it doesn't happen. So it was, but let me just make some general comments. I mean, we are living in a world that's increasingly lacking in global cooperation. It's protectionist, as you say. Supply chains are disrupted, and that means rising inflation in many economies. The nearest parallel, and history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes if you go back to Mark Twain.
He and I did rehearse this, by the way. We just know each other.
Well, it's the 1930s. And the 1930s, we had protectionist, beggar thy neighbor policies. We had recessions. We had governments doing their own thing. And then we had, of course, the lead up to the Second World War, the economic consequences. So I hope we're not in that sort of shift. But there's also some structural shifts that I think reflects this lack of cooperation and see what we're seeing at the moment. Let me just ask some questions. Which is the biggest economy in the world?
China.
America, China. Yeah.
Depends.
It depends how you measure it. So if you measure it at market prices, it's the US. But if you measure it at purchasing power parity, to adjust for the fact that goods and services cost a different amount in different countries, China's been the biggest economy for the past decade. The biggest country in the world in the the dominant economy in the 19th century was Britain. It went into relative decline. The US started to take over it, but that transition period was the 1930s. After the Second World War, the US was a dominant economy, but now China's been growing rapidly since the end of the 70s, early 80s. It's now the biggest economy. And we're in that transition period, that structural transition period. And the problem is when you have that transition period in the past, there's been a lack of global cooperation. You have protectionism, countries going inward looking, and at the extreme, there's wars. And I think, unfortunately, we're in a very, very difficult time. That will mean for the UK economy, disrupted supply chains, as you mentioned, Linda, higher inflation and slower growth. We are dependent on what happens in the rest of the world. We are still a trading nation. And so it will lead to low growth, disrupted growth and lower growth and higher inflation in many economies if that dreadful scenario happens. But the general point is that we're living in a very, very difficult period for the world economy, where there's a lack of cooperation, global shifts, and increasingly countries becoming inward looking. We're preventing trade, we're preventing people. We've seen the issue about immigration, about protectionism, and of course, another election that's emerging, of course, is the US. And unfortunately, if you look at the poll, well, I shouldn't say it. If you look at the polls, whichever way you may have different views, but if you look at the polls, Trump is going to win at the moment. So again, with increased protectionist pressure, if you're making America great again, you're looking inward and you're not looking outward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And indeed, it's a good reminder, the UK, is a open economy. And so one of the reasons why inflation is higher here, 4.6% versus close to about 3% in the US and the Eurozone, is because we pass through more inflation as an open economy. And so therefore global prices, supply chains does tend to have a bigger impact than in, the US, for instance, which, lots of reasons. But now you've got me thinking Trump, Biden. Okay, moving on. So the floor is open if you'd like to ask a question. I will not throw the microphone at you. I will give you the microphone. I always think one of those funny things to do where, when you kind of pass like at some corporate holiday party. Thank you, David. You're saving me. Please introduce yourselves. Tell us your name, what you do, and your question, who you'd like to answer it. So I'm going to go with here, and then I'm going to we'll just pick up these two, and then we'll go over here. And then I would like to encourage the students in the room to ask a question. So prepare yourselves. You're next. And in fact, I can see a friend nominating another friend. So you will be in the third round. Please.
Yeah. Thank you all. Question for all of you. My name's Yueh Grant. I'm one of those unfortunate journalist forecasters who rate even lower than economists. I did successfully predict the Ukraine war and the direction of Putin's attacks, but I did get the survival of Prigozhin wrong. My question for all of you is, which figures are you most confident about in such a service economy, heavily service economy as Britain, compared with even the US, or particularly an economy like Germany? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Journalists do ask really good questions. Costas? Okay.
Which one? I will tell you which one moves less. So historically, the unemployment rate moves less within short periods of time. So we cannot have unemployment today of 5% and in the next quarters, 10%. So bearing with this in mind, I would probably be more confident about my unemployment rate forecasts. However, as I said before, I'm a bit worried about the inability of the ONS to produce right now accurate measures of unemployment. So, for example, if in the next 3 months, the ONS sorts out its survey issues and it announces to us that unemployment is not 4.2%, but it's rather 4.9%, then we have a big problem. And then you will see how fast the Bank of England will be cutting rates, contrary to what they say. Thank you.
Thank you. Part of the ONS's problems is that young people don't answer surveys. And so there's a quite bias in the system. Michael, do you want to quickly take that?
Yeah, I'm not sure they have a lot of reliability on any of them. I think I would probably agree with Costas on unemployment, because it will move less. What it should be probably is actually the interest rate, because the Bank of England is supposed to be giving us forward guidance about what they're going to do next year, but we don't. Some people some people are not so trustful of the Bank of England, and that makes it a real problem for monetary policy if you don't actually trust the institution, and that is again an issue. So I would probably agree with Costas.
Yeah,
Sorry, it's a boring answer, but I think the one that will be least wrong might be the unemployment.
Fascinating. Thank you. Yep. So I said we would go, here and then over there.
Hi.
Apologies to everybody. I'm an economist as well. Damien Mercier, independent economist.
You don't have to apologize. We're all economists.
Thanks, Rex.
Well, apparently, no, not many of the adults are economists, you see. Just wanted to, if I may, and forgive me, I won't ramble on too much, but preface my question with just a couple of quick statements. First of all, there are black swans for everybody to go and see at Chartwell, Churchill's house. One. Two, I think if you study economic history, you just become a better economist, without doubt. And everything then begins to coalesce into its correct place. 3 or 4 weeks ago, The Economist magazine did a really very good survey on the Chinese military in relation not just to hardware, but to software, i.e. people. And the fact that soldiers, all armed forces personnel, because it's a political, Chinese armed services is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. So between a quarter and a third of their time is spent doing political science, which makes them less good soldiers. So that's an interesting structural position. So forgive the ramble. The question is, given what's happened with HS2 and changes partly AI driven, and then on the back of Emily's statement really about commercial real estate, also working from home. So on the one hand, you've got isolated working from home, but the loss of the potential of the economics of agglomeration by routing the north into the south in what is a very unequal country, productivity-wise. Any thoughts about rationalization of us productivity-wise as a country?
Thank you. Michael, the Resolution Foundation did a lot of work on productivity that you referenced.
I refer to, and there's a lot of work done on regional differences, including from my colleagues in Cambridge in the economic geography department. We are far worse for regional imbalances compared to any other high-income country, and particularly compared to Europe. London sucks in so many assets, including most graduates. Every region exports graduates and one imports them, and more than they educate, and that's London. I think there is a general problem, I think, of a lack of investment in the UK economy, but also a lack of investment in infrastructure, particularly public sector investment. And I think that a part of that is an institutional problem in the UK. We don't look longer term. We look to 5-year election cycles, and that's a real problem. So there's no real commitment for long-term growth. Many investments take 10 or 15 years to devise, another 10 or 15 years to implement, and then 10 or 15 years to scale up. And so it doesn't work with a 5-year election cycle, and it doesn't work, unfortunately, with a treasury primarily concerned with fiscal balance and not long-term investment. We tried long-term growth in the UK in the 1960s. It's called the Department of Economic Affairs. A few people in the room may remember it. That was about long-term growth and long-term planning. It lasted just a few years, and it actually got killed off by the treasury. On the regional imbalances, just to make one point on regional imbalances, big regional imbalances, we had something called the regional development agencies that were developed to try and improve regional performance and regional growth. They had real problems getting their act together. They eventually got their act together, and they actually were doing a good job. And the new government came in, and what did it do? It scrapped them. I call it MAD. Mature agency destruction. So once they get to competence levels, somebody comes in and says, no, we're thrown out. So I think it's a general problem, an institutional problem. We don't invest long-term in the growth of the UK economy, and particularly in regional imbalances.
John Hearn, Professor of Economics, Banking and Finance. Quick question for Costas. You mentioned broad money aggregates. You mentioned divisia, which is very unusual, a long time ago. Do you see any time lags between changes in those numbers and inflation, shall we say, and the aggregates you're looking at? But before you answer that, quick comment on Emily, because the students will like to know this. I do consider, I explained to my undergraduates that energy, wages, food have no effect whatsoever on inflation. So Emily and I are showing you that economists disagree with each other. And for Michael, well done for explaining to these undergraduates or potential undergraduates that they can get all their forecasts wrong and still become great economists.
Thank you.
So
Okay,
So
Costas.
thank you. We know that the money affects the economy with long and variable lags. So we know it takes time for money to affect the economy, whether it's inflation or GDP. Now, if you go to my slides, will be online on my website tomorrow, and one of the links I provide there when I refer to money is I have a piece in the conversation where I show using a real-time forecasting model how long it takes for money to impact on inflation. And I do that in my piece. So basically, it takes up to 1 quarter, a minimum of 1 quarter for money to feed through to inflation. Now, you mentioned divisia, and I mentioned divisia. So for those of you that don't know what divisia is the typical M4 measure, which weights the different components of money based on their usefulness in transactions. For instance, cash is more useful for transactions rather than if you have deposits with mutual funds. So my worry, and I will say that on record, is that the Bank of England produces this measure of money, divisia money, which is a very powerful forecasting tool, and they do nothing with it. So I am one of the very few economists, together with my colleague Mike Ellington and others, that are using the Bank of England measure to forecast inflation. It produces great forecasts of inflation. And unfortunately, the very bank that produces the measure doesn't use it. A very puzzling observation for us. Nothing more to add.
Thank you.
Yeah, all I was going to say is adding to John's thing there is that there's about an 18 to 24 months lag from broad money to subsequent inflation, slightly less for normal GDP. So looking at your predictions there, really considering how much the money supply broadly measured has contracted, especially in America, we should be looking at possible deflation by the end of 2024 in the US, and in UK falling well below target. For me, I can't see that all the debt that's been built up through the ZIRP area, the zero interest rate period for 10 years, is sustainable with real interest rates of 4 or 5%. So I think that is going to be a steeper downturn in interest rates because sovereigns cannot afford the debt they've created. And there isn't imported, because we're an open society, there isn't imported inflation. It's purely a monetary cause.
Can I just respond that you're absolutely right, but don't forget that money is only one of the very many determinants of GDP growth or inflation. And in fact, if you look at models of money that predict inflation, also my model, which, as I said, the slides will be out tomorrow. You can click on the link. Money has not a very big. It doesn't have a very big weight in affecting inflation. It does affect inflation, but there are other variables with perhaps bigger weight than money. And of course, when the Bank of England sees that money is dragging down inflation too fast, they will respond to that. So they won't wait for deflation, so they will do something about that. And that's why I'm thinking myself that they will be cutting.
Okay. Okay. You know, there's a joke from the former US President Harry Truman who said, "Just give me a one-handed economist."
Yeah.
All right. I promise to, unfortunately, you are front and center and you have caught my eye and your friend nudged you to ask a question. So now either you have to ask a question or your friend who nudged you is going to have to ask a question. And I know you had your hand up here as well, but I wanted to give some of the, and then introduce yourself, ask your question. And I do want to go to more of the students in the room if possible. By the way, there really is nothing, there's no stupid questions because the more you know, the more you know, the less you know. And you can confer, but maybe not so loudly, maybe on your WhatsApps. Okay, please.
Right. Hello. I am Yueh. I'm from UCL Academy, and I'm a sixth former currently studying economics as an A-level. Yeah. So my question is, as you said, productivity is one of the most important factors affecting the economy. What do you think the UK government should do to improve its productivity and, the recent law about immigration tightening, wouldn't that lower productivity instead of improving it? Just want to know your opinion on it. Thank you.
Great question. Michael?
Yep. As we said, productivity is very, very important because it's the main determinant of wages, profits, and government revenue. So I would agree with that. On your specific immigration issue, I think it will lower growth and it will probably lower productivity. The crucial thing about immigration is, as I said, most people who immigrate are either doing two things: they're working, or they're studying at universities. And many of them, if they stay afterwards, are very entrepreneurial and innovative. But many of our great businesses have been created from people who immigrate to the UK. So I think it's going to lower our short-term growth and our long-term productivity through many transmission mechanisms that are very difficult to model. So I think those rules will lower growth, lower productivity, particularly in the long run. I think the major issues we need to look at for the UK economy is to particularly invest in infrastructure, to invest in human capital. And one of the big challenges we're not good at is the diffusion of innovations. Innovations take a long time to have an impact on growth. Robert Solow, as you probably know, got the Nobel Prize for his work on economic growth. He said in the 80s, I can see the computer age everywhere apart from the productivity statistics. He said, oh, hold on, I can see there's computers everywhere, but why is productivity so low in the United States? It grew 15 or 20 years later. In the 90s and 2000s, productivity surged. And what drove productivity? With the three main sectors were wholesale trade, retail trade, and financial services. And one firm alone explained a third of the trend increase in productivity in the US, and that was Walmart. We don't tend to think innovation and Walmart go hand in hand, but it was using innovations to improve its supply chain. We are not very good at the diffusion of innovations in this country. We are good at technology. Our universities are sometimes world-class in coming up with Nobel Prize winners and patents and licenses, spin-outs, but getting innovation into the boring parts of the economy is difficult and will require government initiatives. So diffusion is important, but it takes a long time to have an impact.
Absolutely. There's a recent study out that shows that the most productive firms in the UK, so the top 10%, account for 64%, or 2/3 of all the productivity. So the rest of the firms, that diffusion is really key. So the policies the government should be focused on is all the things that Michael said, including, of course, what he said earlier, which is a longer term focus, maybe a growth strategy or two. I'm going to look over here because there were a lot of activity, and I'm hoping that all that activity has produced a question. Okay. The microphone is coming around. David is a really nice guy, but he's just going to stand there until one of you asks a question. So don't be shy. No question is stupid, honestly. I love the negotiation. I think it's you. Yeah.
When you make a forecast, what is the first thing that you look at, and what is the biggest thing that will impact what you're going to choose for your forecast?
Bravo. You didn't want to ask that? All right. Emily.
So yeah, I suppose that's, are you making judgment-based forecasts? Are you doing some kind of econometric modeling? I think if we're a judgment-based forecast, I'm probably thinking about consumption. So how a household's going to consume over the next period, which informs the GDP forecast, and sort of things fall into place from that. So that's probably the starting point. If it's an econometric modeling thing, it's more like bung everything in and see what sticks.
Thank you. In fact, I think the treasurer is called the black box. You had a question here. You wanted to. Yeah. Okay. So the mic is coming back around. Introduce yourself as well, please.
I'm Yasin Malik. I also study at the UCL Academy 6th form, economics, of course. You mentioned that I'd like to preface this by saying I also do study politics. You mentioned that at May 2024 election, it could have an effect on the UK economy. And you may mention if there was a conservative win. However, And what you didn't mention is that, Labour, the opposing Labour Party, it has had higher approval ratings than ever before, and it is, I predict, and many people like me have also predicted that there is a definite Labour win. So my question is, how would a hypothetical Labour win affect the UK economy?
Great question too. Right. Costa, since there's one of your.
I think the way to look at it is because everybody has, let's say, everybody believes now that Labour are going to win. So the question is how the economy is going to be affected if Labour are not going to win. So that's what I want to see. Because you see, then we're going to have a super shock, which goes against predictions. And then it will be interesting to see how firms are going to be adjusting to this new reality. So that would be an interesting experiment, which I don't want to judge, but it would be interesting from a historical point of view for the rest of us to see how it's going to evolve.
Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I think it's likely that Labour will win at the moment, but I think that there'll be, in terms of the long-term growth of the economy, I don't think it'll have any big impact whether it's a Conservative government or the Labour government. As it stands at the moment, I think the Labour Party are frightened of saying anything that will spook the electorate or spook the markets. So they're not committing anything that will involve any major change in long-term growth of the British economy. So I don't think it may have a short-term impact on some markets, exchange rate and so on, in terms of the long-term impact. As it stands, unless they do something that they're not saying at the moment, or they announce something before the election, I don't think it's going to shift the long-term growth path of the economy.
So we have time for one more final question. Oh, we've got two, we've got three. So I think we'll take both of your questions and then we'll wrap. So we'll take them together.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Lockstock-Cloutier. I don't study economics, but I am interested in economics, which is why I'm here. And this is a question for Michael. You did say that we cannot predict Black Swans events, but what is an event that's hinting at one occurring in 2024? Thank you.
Ooh, good probing one. And then just pass the mic back to, there you go. Ask your question.
Oh yeah, I'm Owen Tucker, also a sixth form student. I do study economics, and this question is also focused at Michael. In the current political climate, do you think that countries are actually incentivized to be internally focused, as it makes them sort of less at risk to external supply shocks, and if so, what can be done to change those attitudes?
That's a great question. Both for you, Michael.
Okay. The first one on is a more likelihood of a black swan? And two great questions, by the way. I'd probably go back to the points I tried to make earlier. That I think we're living in a period of global uncertainty and global instability, and so that creates the potential for greater conflict. And that conflict may be economic conflict, trade wars, protectionism. It may be geopolitical conflict. It could be even military conflict. So I think we're living in a very, very unstable period, a lack of global cooperation and a lack. I actually think that the challenges for our economies in the world are the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, and the fact we need a new Bretton Woods for the world we're now living in, particularly in terms of climate change. So the global instability and global conflict creates a possible black swan event, with perhaps catastrophic events. Then the other question, I think, was about internally focused. Countries are becoming internally focused. Now, I should add that I've written a book on protectionism in the 1930s with my colleague Solomouth, and we actually argued that protectionism was good for Britain in the 1930s, which economic historians didn't like it. You can probably still get this book, but it's certainly not a bestseller like Linda's books. So I have a little bit of history of doing this. I think the problem with when you become internally looking, when you put restrictions on trade, when you put restrictions on people coming into a country, when you're nearshoring or friendshoring rather than offshoring. Those create economic costs for many countries, and they create economic problems. Why is it actually happening? I think it's happening because of the structural changes I mentioned earlier. The world's shifting from west to east, and that's an important aspect. The other important aspect is when countries suffer from high unemployment or high inflation, or two together, stagflation, or increasing lack of wage growth because of productivity problems, we get an issue that we see in many countries. We saw it in the 1930s, we saw it in the 70s, we're seeing it now, and it's the process of othering. You blame others for your problem. And you blame others, you say, actually, it's foreign firms, it's a foreign government, it's a European government, it's foreign businesses, it's foreign people coming in, taking my jobs and claiming unemployment benefit. You think, well, hold on, they can't do both. And so there's a whole process of othering we see. And that's a particular challenge. The way you reduce othering is actually to get the economy growing again. Because you don't blame others when your wages are going up and you've got a stable job and a good job. So there is an economic issue here that if we get the economy growing, perhaps we can stop blaming others for some of our economic plight.
Fantastic, thank you. We have just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to do something I've never actually done before, but I think it might be interesting. So given that we heard that the public forecasts better than the Titans, I'm going to ask for a show of hands on some of these key ones and just see where this audience sits, what the public thinks. So on GDP growth, Emily is the one who's got the three negatives. She's got 3/4 of contracting GDP. A recession is technically 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. We've got probably the more optimistic one. Michael is in the middle. Costas has a contraction and then growth. So how many of you think we will have a recession next year? So in line with Emily, just a show of hands. Oh, interesting. Okay. So how many of you think it's more like Costa, where you're going to end up seeing recovery towards the back half of next year? Okay.
No, they're agreeing with both.
Yeah. Oh, people have voted twice. What about Michael? Stagnant, not much happening. Interesting. Okay. So I think on the whole, pretty evenly split, but a relatively optimistic crowd, which, by the way, I think is fantastic. Everyone says that economics is the dismal science. No, I don't think so. I think, it's good stuff coming in the future. So I'm not going to do all of them, but I think just on inflation, which I think is also a fascinating one. So roughly speaking, everyone has the same trajectory of inflation actually slowing. So this is actually just a show of hands as to how many of you think that will be the course of inflation over the course of 2024, where inflation will simply slow towards the end of the year. If you think so, raise your hand. Yeah, okay. So when the next energy shock comes, just remember you were right. You just couldn't have foreseen that. Great. I just thought it would be really interesting to take a look, get a sense of the room. And we are out of time. Actually, because they were such good speakers, we actually have more time for Q&A, and I'm glad it allowed some of the students in the room to jump in, and all of you for the great questions. But really, I now just have 3 thanks to do. The first thanks, of course, is to the incredible Titans, Emily, Michael, and Costas. The second thanks is actually to David back there, and to the entire team, and to thank you all for supporting the Economic Research Council. And the final thanks is actually to all of you who are interested in economics and are economists, maybe could be economists, or just interested. It's exactly this kind of public discussion and forum that makes the world of economics a better place, engagement. So thank you for not being put off by the maths, and thank you very much for taking your evening to come here and join us. And especially to the students, you should put this on your personal statements and apply for economics programs. Thank you all.